December 10, 1944. The village of Lanzerath, Belgium. The frozen soil crunched beneath heavy boots as First Lieutenant Lyle Book surveyed the ridgeline that would become his platoon's final defensive line. At just 20 years old, he was among the youngest commissioned officers in the U.S. Army. Yet the burden of leadership pressed heavily on his shoulders as he studied the snow-draped fields stretching toward the German frontier. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment had received orders that would place 18 soldiers between the weight of Nazi Germany's final gamble in the road to Allied triumph. None of them could have foreseen that within 6 days, their stand would delay an entire SS Panzer Division for nearly a full day, reshaping the timetable of Hitler's Ardennes offensive and contributing directly to the ultimate Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans were coming. The only uncertainty was when. Book had been born into a very different world. Growing up in St. Louis during the Great Depression, his family moved often, living in small houses with just one bedroom, no running water, and no electricity. At 14, desperate to help his struggling family, he walked into a National Guard recruitment office and enlisted in the headquarters company of Missouri's 138th Infantry Regiment. No one questioned his age. For $1 per drill day, young Lyle Book became a soldier. By 16, he had risen to supply sergeant, earning more than most of his civilian friends and sending money home to support his 4 siblings. The hardship of his youth had forged a quiet resilience, one that would later prove vital on a frozen Belgian ridge. When the 35th Infantry Division was activated for federal duty on December 23, 1940, Book participated in the famed Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, where he excelled as transportation sergeant for regimental headquarters. His outstanding performance caught the attention of his superiors. After Pearl Harbor changed the course of the war, Book volunteered for officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he underwent 4 months of demanding training that transformed him from an experienced enlisted man into a capable combat leader. On August 25, 1942, he graduated 4th in his class of 57 officers, earning a post as an instructor teaching small unit defensive tactics to future leaders. After a year at Fort Benning, he transferred to the 99th Infantry Division for deployment to Europe, where the lessons he once taught would soon be tested under far harsher conditions than any training ground. The 99th Division arrived at Le Havre, France in early November 1944. They were green troops, untested in battle, arriving at what was believed to be a quiet sector of the front. The Allied advance since D-Day had been relentless. Paris had fallen in August, Brussels in September, Antwerp soon after. The momentum appeared unstoppable. The Ardennes region of Belgium, with its dense forests and rugged terrain, was considered a rest area, ideal for seasoning new divisions before major engagements. By mid-November, the 99th had relieved the 60th Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division. The sector was eerily calm. Too calm. Book assumed command of the INR platoon attached to the 394th Infantry Regiment, an elite unit of expert marksmen and peak-condition soldiers. Many had been college students before the war, members of the Army Specialized Training Program before it was abruptly terminated to provide infantry replacements. The platoon, typically 25 men, was organized into 2 9-man recon squads and a 7-man headquarters section. Their mission: conduct deep reconnaissance, capture prisoners for intelligence, locate enemy units, and act as the eyes and ears of the regiment. They were not meant for prolonged combat. They were scouts in uniform, trained to observe, report, and vanish. For several weeks, the platoon ran hazardous patrols behind enemy lines, slipping through snow-clogged forests shrouded in fog, sometimes reaching as far as Losheim, 2 miles beyond German positions. They captured prisoners, gathered intelligence, and earned their combat infantryman badges through bravery under constant risk. Despite the danger, casualties remained low. The German units opposite them seemed passive, merely holding the Siegfried Line. Intelligence suggested their strength was depleted after years of fighting on multiple fronts. Then, On December 10th, everything changed. Major Robert Kriz, commanding officer of the 394th, summoned Buch to headquarters with new orders. The platoon was to move immediately to Lanzerath. About 6 miles southeast of Hüningen-Lanzerath was a small hamlet, just 23 houses and a church, perched on a key road junction in the northern Losheim Gap, a 5-mile gap between the 99th Division to the north and the 106th to the south. It was a dangerous weak point in the American line. Reports showed increased German movement nearby. Buch's platoon would plug the gap and provide early warning of any enemy assault. Behind them, roads led directly into the American rear, an ideal route for a German breakthrough. As Buch studied his maps, the weight of the task became evident. His platoon, down to 18 men, was expected to hold a 5-mile stretch of the line. The only backup was the 3rd Battalion of the 394th, several miles away. If the Germans attacked in force, his men would stand alone. The situation was even more precarious than it seemed. The INR platoon would operate under Task Force X, a small detachment from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion, 55 men with 4 towed 3-inch guns, and 22 men from the 820th 2nd Recon Platoon, mounted on an armored half-track and 2 jeeps. On paper, it looked adequate. In practice, they had never trained together and lacked unified command. Arriving at Lanzerath on December 10th, Buch immediately began fortifying his defense. He chose a wooded ridge northwest of the village overlooking open fields descending toward the road to the east, an ideal vantage. The men dug foxholes along the tree line, carefully spaced for interlocking fire, camouflaged and reinforced against artillery. Recent snowfall provided perfect concealment, rendering them nearly invisible from the fields below. Their weapons were placed with precision. 2 30-caliber machine guns covered the main approaches. Buch had personally obtained a jeep-mounted 50-caliber heavy machine gun, a formidable weapon capable of shredding enemy formations at range. He positioned it in defilade, able to strike targets approaching from the south while remaining shielded from return fire. The platoon zeroed all weapons on a farm, fence that bisected the field approximately 100 yards from their position, creating a predetermined kill zone. The men set tripwires connected to empty cans filled with rocks to detect infiltrators attempting to approach through the woods at night. They established communications with battalion, headquarters at Losim Graben via telephone, landline, and maintained radio, contact with regimental headquarters at Hüningen. Patrols were sent into Lanzerath itself to coordinate with Task Force X and the reconnaissance platoon positioned there. The men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon settled into their frozen foxholes and waited. The temperature dropped well below freezing. A bitter wind swept across the ridge, interspersed with periods of snowfall. 4 to 5 inches of snow blanketed the position, further camouflaging their foxholes. The cold was brutal, but the men endured. They were young, most in their late teens or early 20s, far from home, defending a ridge in Belgium that few of them could have found on a map before the war. For 5 days, they watched and waited. German activity across the border increased noticeably. On the night of December 15th, Buch and his men heard the rumble of vehicles moving in the darkness to the east. Something was building. Reports came in from other units of unusual enemy movements. The Germans were bringing up reinforcements, massing forces along the Siegfrieded line. American commanders noted the activity but interpreted it as defensive preparations, expecting a German response to the ongoing American attack toward the Royer River dams further north. The possibility of a major German offensive seemed remote. The Wehrmacht was beaten, its strength depleted, its resources exhausted, or so American intelligence believed. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16, 1944, the world exploded. A massive artillery barrage erupted along an 80-mile front as 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment was the opening move of Operation Wachthamren, Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The objective was breathtaking in its ambition: break through the American lines in the Ardennes, drive to the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. For this offensive, Hitler had scraped together his last reserves. 3 entire armies, including elite SS panzer divisions that had been refitted and reinforced, would smash through what Hitler believed was a weak sector of the American line held by inexperienced troops. The artillery barrage lasted 90 minutes. Shells crashed down across the entire front, targeting command posts, communication lines, and forward positions. The men of B's platoon huddled in their foxholes as the forest around them erupted in explosions. Tree branches shattered and fell. The concussion of near misses hammered their bodies. The frozen ground shook with each detonation. Yet, remarkably, the barrage was not particularly effective against their well-prepared positions on the ridge. The Germans were firing blind, unable to pinpoint the exact location of the American foxholes. When the barrage lifted at 7, the men emerged from their holes, shaken but unharmed. The telephone line to battalion headquarters had been severed, but their radios still functioned. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, the platoon watched in growing alarm as Task Force X withdrew from Lanzerath. The tank destroyers and reconnaissance unit, which had been their primary support, pulled back without explanation and without informing Book. His platoon was now completely alone, the only American unit between the German border and the rear areas of the 99th Infantry Division. Through the early morning mist, Boo observed movement to the east. Soldiers were forming up, hundreds of them. Far more than his intelligence briefings had suggested were in the area. He radioed regimental headquarters and requested permission to withdraw, to conduct a fighting retreat and delay the enemy while preserving his force. The response came back immediately and unequivocally. Remain in position. Reinforcements from the 3rd Battalion would come forward to support them. Hold at all costs. At approximately 8 3 men from the platoon, Sergeant William Slate, Private James Silva, and Technician 5th Grade Sam Jenkins, moved down to establish an observation post in a house on the eastern edge of Lanzerath that had been abandoned by Task Force X. B accompanied them to make a final assessment of the situation. What he saw through the early morning light made his blood run cold. A column of approximately 500 German soldiers was marching toward Lanzerath from the direction of Losheim. Their distinctive helmet silhouette identified them as Falscher Jäger, German paratroopers among the elite troops Germany could still field. These were not the exhausted, demoralized soldiers that American intelligence had described. These were combat veterans moving with discipline and purpose, advancing to exploit what they believed would be a clean breakthrough of American lines. Book and the observation team scrambled back to the ridge and alerted the platoon, 500 German paratroopers against 18 American soldiers. The odds were approximately 28-1. Everything in Book's training told him to withdraw, to avoid decisive engagement against such overwhelming force, but his orders were explicit. Hold at all costs. The German column reached Lanzerath and began moving through the village. An elderly Belgian woman, frightened by the arrival of German troops, approached a group of German officers gathered near a cafe. She spoke to them, gesturing toward Therage where the American positions were concealed. Whether she intentionally betrayed the American location or was simply trying to protect her village from destruction remains unknown. What is certain is that the information reached the German commander, who immediately began deploying his battalion for an assault on the American position. At approximately 10 the first wave of German paratroopers emerged from Lanzerath and began advancing up the snow-covered slope toward the American foxholes. They moved in textbook infantry assault formation, spread out in extended lines, weapons at the ready. The morning sun reflected off the fresh snow, creating brilliant illumination across the battlefield. The Germans could see the wood line clearly, but had no indication of the exact location of American positions. They advanced confidently, expecting light resistance, if any at all. Burke watched them come, waiting for the perfect moment. His men lay silent in their camouflaged foxholes, weapons aimed at the fence line they had zeroed days before. The Germans crossed the fence, continuing their advance. 100 yards, 90 yards, 80 yards. At approximately 75 YDs, BA gave the command that would begin one of the most remarkable defensive stands in American military history. The American position erupted in fire. Two 30-caliber machine guns opened up simultaneously, their interlocking fields of fire creating a wall of lead across the snow-covered slope. M1 rifles cracked with devastating accuracy as the expert marksmen of the platoon engaged individual targets. The effect was catastrophic. German paratroopers fell in windows, cut down by the precise, disciplined fire. The fence line that the Germans had just crossed became a killing zone. Men tried to take cover behind it, but the wooden fence provided no protection against rifle bullets. The 50-caliber machine gun joined the fight, its heavy slugs capable of penetrating multiple targets. The distinctive sound of the big weapon echoed across the valley like a giant tearing canvas. The first German assault lasted only minutes before the survivors retreated back toward Lanzerath, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded scattered across the snow. The Americans had suffered no casualties. The shock of Thiemenbusch had been complete. The German battalion commander, assessing his casualties and the strength of the position that had just destroyed his assault wave, made the reasonable but incorrect assumption that he was facing a much larger American force, possibly a full company with heavy weapons support. He decided to try again, this time with better fire support. Artillery and mortar fire began falling on the American position as the Germans prepared for a second assault. Around noon, the second wave came. More German paratroopers emerged from Lanzerath, this time moving more cautiously, using available cover, providing suppressing fire as they advanced. The American position once more erupted with defensive fire. Machine guns swept across the advancing formations, while riflemen selected their targets with the precision that had earned them places in the elite, intelligence and reconnaissance. Platoon, the 50-caliber machine gun, roared at clusters of Germans, attempting to assemble for a charge on the American lines. Again, the assault collapsed under the disciplined fire of the defenders. German losses mounted steadily. The snow-covered field was soon spattered with blood, bodies lying where they had fallen, a grim testament to the accuracy of American marksmanship. The Germans withdrew yet again, but this time they maintained suppressive fire. Machine guns positioned in Lanzerath raked the American woodline. Mortars continued to fall, trying to obliterate or pin down the defenders. The situation was becoming dire. Ammunition was being burned through at a dangerous rate. Several men had been injured by shell fragments. The Germans were learning the layout of the American defenses with each renewed attack. It was only a matter of time before they found the flanks and encircled the position. Boak radioed regimental headquarters once more, reporting the situation and requesting authorization to withdraw before being trapped. Again, the reply came, "Hold your ground. Reinforcements are en route." Around 2 p.m., the Germans launched their third major assault, committing additional troops and attacking with even greater ferocity. The American defenders unleashed a storm of gunfire on the advancing enemy, but the overwhelming numbers began to tell. Private Billy Queen, one of the 4 forward artillery observers attached to the platoon, was manning a position when a German bullet struck him in the abdomen. He collapsed, mortally wounded. With no medic or surgical tools, his comrades could only make him comfortable. Queen died within minutes, the platoon's sole fatality that day. Sergeant William Slate took over the 50-caliber machine gun as the third assault reached its height. He fired burst after burst into the German ranks, the heavy weapon kicking violently against its mount. He fired so long that the barrel began to glow red-hot. The heat caused the gun to fire on its own before the barrel warped and jammed. The platoon's most powerful weapon was now useless at the worst possible moment. Even so, the third German attack also collapsed under the defenders' fire. The paratroopers fell back once more, leaving the field strewn with their dead and wounded. The German battalion commander now faced a crisis. His force had suffered at least 92 confirmed casualties, gutting his effective strength. He was expected to have cleared this route hours earlier, paving the way for follow-on units. Instead, he remained bogged down against what he believed to be a far larger American force. As dusk fell, the situation for the Americans became unsustainable. They had fought for nearly 10 hours without relief. Ammunition was nearly gone, most of the men were wounded, and contact with headquarters was lost. The 50 caliber gun was destroyed. The Germans finally began maneuvering around the flanks rather than charging head-on. German paratroopers soon infiltrated from multiple directions, engaging in close-quarters combat within the foxholes. The outcome was inevitable. The Germans systematically overran each position. A German soldier fired into Boke's foxhole, wounding him in the leg and seriously injuring the man beside him. Boke was captured at gunpoint. Within minutes, the platoon was overrun. 15 men were taken prisoner immediately. 2 others, Privates Jenkins and Preston, had been sent earlier to summon reinforcements and were captured the next day. 3 men, Robinson, McGee, and Silva, managed to escape toward Losheimer Graben, eventually reaching American lines. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge was over. 18 men from the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, aided by 4 artillery observers, had held off a German battalion of roughly 500 paratroopers for nearly an entire day. They inflicted 92 confirmed casualties while suffering only 1 killed and 14 wounded before being overwhelmed. More importantly, they had accomplished something far greater than inflicting losses. They had delayed the entire German offensive in the northern sector for almost 20 hours as the captured. Americans were gathered in Lanzerath and treated for their wounds by German medics who had set up aid stations in village homes. The full significance of their stand became apparent. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, bloodied and exhausted, made no attempt to resume its advance that night. Its commander, fearing that the woods beyond Lanzerath hid more Americans, perhaps even tanks, chose to pause and consolidate rather than risk an advance in darkness. That cautious decision would have ripple effects throughout the entire German offensive. Around midnight, nearly 12 hours behind schedule, German armor finally rolled into Lanzerath. It was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most powerful armored spearhead of the entire offensive. Commanded by SS Obersturmführer Joachim Peiper, it numbered around 4,800 men and 800 vehicles, including 117 tanks, among them the dreaded Tiger and King Tiger heavy tanks. Peiper's mission was crucial: drive to the Meuse River, seize the bridges, and hold them for following forces. Speed was vital. The plan called for him to reach the Meuse on the first day. Instead, he found himself bottled up behind a battered parachute regiment that had spent an entire day fighting a platoon-sized enemy. Peiper was livid. He confronted Hauptmann Helmuth von Hoffmann, commander of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, in a heated exchange witnessed by American prisoners. Peiper demanded to know why the route wasn't cleared, why reconnaissance hadn't been conducted, why they hadn't pushed forward. Hoffmann explained his unit's heavy losses and exhaustion, but Peiper, unimpressed, led his own reconnaissance patrol, discovering that the woods ahead were empty. The small platoon that had stalled the German timetable for nearly a full day had numbered only 18 men. By the time Peiper resumed his advance, it was 4:30 a.m. on December 17th, more than 18 hours late. That delay proved disastrous for German strategy. The offensive relied on precise timing and movement. The holdup at Lanzerath created massive traffic jams on the narrow roads. Units piled up behind the bottleneck, losing critical momentum. Meanwhile, American commanders, initially caught off guard, used those precious hours to rush reinforcements into place. By the time Peiper's column finally broke free, his route was contested. Though his group achieved short-term successes, capturing fuel depots and advancing deep into American territory, the delay at Lanzerath had shifted the balance. Reinforced American divisions blocked his path. Air support returned as weather cleared, and fighter bombers ravaged the stalled German armor. The 18 men who fought on that frozen Belgian ridge had changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. By December 22nd, Kampfgruppe Peiper found itself surrounded in the small town of Leyes, cut off from supplies, nearly out of fuel and ammunition. The once mighty battle group that had begun the offensive with 4,800 men and 117 tanks was reduced to approximately 800 men with no operational armor. The night of December 23rd, Piper ordered his remaining men to abandon all vehicles and equipment and escape on foot back to German lines. They left behind more than 100 vehicles, including 6 King Tiger tanks in Lays. The spearhead of the German 6th Panzer Army had been stopped. The breakthrough that was supposed to reach Antwerp had gotten less than halfway to the Meuse River. The carefully crafted timetable disrupted on the very first day by 18 American soldiers on a frozen ridge never recovered. Meanwhile, the captured members of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon began their own ordeal. The men who could walk were marched east toward Germany. Those too seriously wounded to move were left in German field hospitals. After 2 days of walking through bitter cold, the prisoners were loaded into a railroad boxcar at the village of Unarat. Bulge found himself crammed into a single cattle car with 71 other American PS. They traveled for days without food or water. By Christmas Day, 7 men in Bulge's car had died, and the rest were barely clinging to life. Eventually, the prisoners were transported to hospitals in Frankfurt and Hanover for treatment of their wounds. From there, they were sent to P camps where they would remain for the next 5 months until liberated by Allied forces in April 1945. Lieutenant Bulge considered the outcome December 16th a complete failure. His unit had been overrun. Most of his men had been wounded. All had been captured. The mission to hold the position had ended with the position being lost. He had no way of knowing that his platoon had accomplished something far more significant than simply holding ground. Due to lost communications and the chaos of the offensive's opening days, American commanders had no immediate knowledge of what the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon had achieved. The unit's actions were lost in the confusion of the broader battle. When the war ended and the prisoners were finally freed, most of the platoon's members just wanted to go home. They were tired, wounded, traumatized by months of captivity in disease-infested P camps. The last thing they wanted was attention or recognition. It was only gradually in the years after the war that the full significance of the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge began to emerge. Historians examining German after-action reports discovered that the 18-hour delay caused by resistance at Lanzerath had fundamentally disrupted the timetable of the 6th Panzer Army. The task of defeating the 99th Infantry Division had been assigned to the 12th SS Panzer Division, reinforced by additional units. Despite more than 10 days of intense fighting, the 12th SS Panzer Division was never able to dislodge American forces from Elsenborn Ridge, where elements of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions had established a defensive line. The northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge became a sticking point for the entire German offensive. Had the initial breakthrough occurred on schedule, German forces might have overrun the massive American supply depots around Lies and Spar, fundamentally changing the course of the battle. The men of the platoon gradually learned what they had accomplished. In June 1966, to Bulge's surprise, a Silver Star medal arrived in his mailbox with no ceremony or explanation. No other members of the platoon received recognition, which upset Bal deeply. Shortly afterward, he was interviewed by John S. D. Eisenhower for the book The Bitter Woods, which described the platoon's actions in detail. Eisenhower, who later became ambassador to Belgium, hosted Bulge and other platoon members when they visited Lanzerath in December 1969. The village had been rebuilt after the war, and the Belgians welcomed the American veterans who had fought to protect their country. One platoon member whose wounds particularly troubled him was William James, whose real name was Takanikas. He endured 37 operations attempting to repair the damage from his combat wounds before dying from complications on June 22, 1977. Columnist Jack Anderson learned of James's story and launched a campaign to have him posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The campaign brought national attention to the platoon's actions for the first time. Congressional hearings were held to examine whether the platoon deserved greater recognition. The hearings resulted in a recommendation that James receive the Medal of Honor. And, remarkably, Congress passed Public Law 96145 signed by President Jimmy Carter on December 14, 1979, which specifically waived the normal time limitations exclusively for members of the 394th Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, the Army and Air Force, concurred with the Medal of Honor recommendation, but the Marine Corps, which had to approve all such awards, responded that James had failed to show sufficient intrepidity to merit the nation's highest decoration. The decision was controversial and remains so to this day. Nevertheless, the congressional attention led to a comprehensive review of the platoon's actions. On October 26, 1981, 36 years after the battle, the members of the platoon finally received formal recognition for their valor. And of the original 18 were present at a ceremony at Fort Meade, Virginia, hosted by Secretary of the Army John Omar. The decorations were extraordinary. 4 members, including Lieutenant Book, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor. 5 members received the Silver Star. 9 members received the Bronze Star with V device for valor. The entire platoon was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, recognizing them collectively as a unit. These decorations made the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment the most decorated American platoon of its size for a single action in World War II. The ceremony in 1981 finally gave the men the recognition they had earned decades earlier. Book, by then a successful chiropractor, spoke emotionally about his men and their sacrifice. He maintained that the real heroes were those who had fought beside him, particularly those like Billy Queen, who had given their lives, and William James, whose wounds had ultimately killed him years after the battle. The recognition meant everything to the veterans. For nearly 4 decades they had carried the belief that they had failed, that their capture represented a defeat. Now, finally, they understood that their desperate stand on a frozen ridge had contributed materially to Allied victory in one of the war's most critical battles. The Belgian government unveiled an official monument at the Lanzerath Ridge site on May 12, 2005. The memorial, a simple but dignified stone marker, honors all who fought there on December 16, 1944. The inscription notes that 18 American soldiers held this position against 500 German paratroopers, delaying the advance of an entire SS Panzer division and contributing to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. The monumentas become a pilgrimage site for military historians and veterans' families. Each year on December 16th, a small ceremony is held to remember the battle. Belgian schoolchildren learn about what happened on the ridge overlooking their village. The story of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon has become part of the local heritage. Lyle Book lived to see all of this recognition. He married, raised a family, and built a successful career as a chiropractor, practicing from 1949 until his retirement in 1997. He never spoke much about the war until late in life when he finally began sharing his experiences with historians and researchers. He maintained contact with the surviving members of his platoon, attending reunions and memorial services. When fellow platoon members passed away, Book would often deliver eulogies, speaking about their courage and sacrifice. He lobbied tirelessly for recognition not for himself, but for his men. The decorations that finally came in 1981 were the result of years of letter-writing campaigns, congressional testimony, and persistent advocacy by Book on behalf of his soldiers. On December 2, 2016, First Lieutenant Lyle Book died of pneumonia at the age of 92, just days before his 93rd birthday. He was the last surviving officer of the platoon. His death was noted in military publications and newspapers around the country. The New York Times published a substantial obituary recognizing his role in one of World War II's most remarkable defensive stands. Veterans organizations honored his memory. The surviving members of the 99th Infantry Division held memorial services. He was buried with full military honors. In his eulogy, speakers noted that Book had spent his final decades ensuring that his men received the recognition they deserved, never seeking attention for himself, always directing credit to those who had served under his command. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge stands as one of the most remarkable small unit actions in American military history. Soldiers, led by a 20-year-old lieutenant, held off 500 enemy troops for nearly a full day, inflicting 92 confirmed casualties while suffering only 1 killed and 14 wounded before finally being overwhelmed. More significantly, they delayed the advance of the entire German 6th Panzer Army for 18 critical hours at the opening of Germany's last major offensive in the West. The delay allowed American forces to respond to the surprise attack to rush, reinforcements to threatened sectors to establish defensive lines that would ultimately contain and defeat the German breakthrough. The mathematics of the battle are straightforward. The German offensive required precise adherence to a rigid timetable. K.F. Grouper Piper, the spearhead of the assault, was supposed to reach the Moose River on December 16th. Instead, they were stuck behind a parachute regiment that had spent an entire day fighting what they believed was a large American force, but was actually just 18 men. When Piper finally got moving on the morning of December 17th, he was 18 hours behind schedule. He never made up that time. American reinforcements reached blocking positions before he could break through. The fuel he needed was destroyed or captured by American forces who had time to react because of the delay. The bridges he needed to cross were blown by American engineers who had time to prepare because of the delay. The air support that would eventually destroy his battle group was able to take off and find targets because of the delay. Every hour that Book's platoon held that ridge gave American commanders time to respond to the crisis. The 1st Infantry Division had time to move into position. The 2nd Infantry Division had time to establish defenses on Elsenborn Ridge. The 7th Armored Division had time to reach St. Vith. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had time to deploy to Vermont and Bastonia. Of these movements, critical to containing the German breakthrough were made possible by the time-bought unit actions like the stand at Lanzerath. Military historians have calculated that if the German timetable had been maintained, if Quamp Grouper Piper had reached the MOS on schedule, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge might have been very different. The Allies would still likely have won, but at a far higher cost in casualties and time. The story of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon resonates because it embodies fundamental military virtues. 18 young men, vastly outnumbered, facing overwhelming odds, chose to stand and fight rather than retreat. They followed orders to hold their position, even when those orders seemed to require the impossible. They fought with skill and courage throughout a Daeong battle, inflicting disproportionate casualties on a numerically superior enemy. They maintained unit cohesion and discipline under extreme pressure. When finally overwhelmed, they surrendered with honor, having accomplished far more than anyone had a right to expect. Their story demonstrates that in war, small units in the right place at the right time can have strategic effects far beyond their size. The platoon's action also illustrates the importance of leadership at the small unit level. Lieutenant Buck was 20 years old, one of the youngest officers in the Army, commanding men who were in many cases older than he was. Yet his leadership throughout the battle was exemplary. He positioned his unit wisely, using terrain to maximum advantage. He maintained fire discipline, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the ambush. He directed fire effectively during the battle, ensuring that weapons supported each other. He communicated with higher headquarters, attempting to provide them with accurate intelligence about the situation. When ordered to hold, despite impossible odds, he transmitted that order to his men, and they obeyed. His personal courage under fire, moving between positions during the battle, encouraged his soldiers. When finally wounded and captured, his first concern was for his men. The men of the platoon were equally remarkable. They were expert marksmen who had been selected for the intelligence and reconnaissance role because of their superior skills during the battle. That expertise showed. Each burst from their machine guns, each shot from their rifles was aimed and effective. They did not panic fire or waste ammunition. They maintained their positions despite artillery fire, despite being wounded, despite watching Billy Queen die, despite knowing they were massively outnumbered with no hope of reinforcement. The discipline and courage they displayed was extraordinary. These were not hardened combat veterans. The 99th Infantry Division was green, newly arrived in Europe, untested in battle. Yet, when the moment came, these young men fought like seasoned professionals. The German forces that opposed them were no slouches. The 9th Fulcher Jäger Regiment of the 3rd Fulcher Jäger Division were paratroopers, elite troops, even by German standards. They had combat experience from earlier campaigns. They outnumbered the Americans approximately 28-1. They had artillery and mortar support. They should have overrun the American position in the first assault. That they failed to do so for nearly a full day speaks to both the skill of the defenders and the advantages of prepared defensive positions occupied by disciplined troops. The Germans showed courage in continuing to attack despite mounting casualties. Their battalion commander showed tactical competence in eventually probing for the flanks rather than continuing futile frontal assaults. But by the time they succeeded in overwhelming the position, they had suffered casualties that effectively destroyed their unit as an effective fighting force. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge also demonstrated the fog of war and its effects on military operations. American commanders had no idea what Book's platoon was accomplishing because communications were cut. The platoon fought in isolation, unaware that their resistance was having strategic effects. When they were finally overrun and captured, Lieutenant Bourke believed he had failed. The mission had been to hold the position, and the position had been lost. He carried that sense of failure for decades. Similarly, German commanders were operating with incomplete information. The battalion commander attacking the ridge believed he was facing a much larger force, probably a full company with heavy weapons. That belief led to cautious tactics and the decision to halt the advance after dark. The German High Command had no real-time understanding of why their timetable was falling apart on the first day. Only after the battle, when historians could examine records from both sides, did the full picture emerge. The treatment of the captured Americans by their German captives was generally correct. Following the Geneva Conventions, the Germans provided medical treatment to the wounded in aid stations set up in Lanzerath homes. They allowed the prisoners to receive treatment before being marched to the rear. This stands in stark contrast to the Malmö massacre that occurred the following day when elements of Camp Grouper Piper murdered American prisoners. The difference highlights that war crimes were not universal German practice, but were often unit-specific, reflecting the leadership and character of particular commanders. The paratroopers who captured Book's platoon were professional soldiers who followed the rules of war. Piper's SS troops, by contrast, committed one of the war's most notorious atrocities. The prisoner of war experience of the platoon members was harrowing. Craminto cattle cars without food or water, watching fellow prisoners die from exposure and dehydration, spending months in disease-infested camps with inadequate food and medical care. The men suffered tremendously. Several nearly died from their wounds and the conditions of captivity. When finally liberated in April 1945, they were skeletal, ill, traumatized. Many carried physical and psychological wounds from their captivity for the rest of their lives. William James endured decades of surgeries attempting to repair damage from his combat wounds before finally succumbing to complications. These men paid a heavy price for their service. The delayed recognition of the platoon's actions points to a systemic problem in military awards and decorations. The chaos of combat, particularly in a confused situation like the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, meant that many acts of valor went unrecognized. When units were overrun or captured, their accomplishments were often lost in the fog of war. The fact that it took 36 years for Book's platoon to receive proper recognition is a testament to the inadequacy of the system. Only through persistent advocacy by Lieutenant Book, coverage by journalists like Jack Anderson, congressional hearings, and eventually special legislation did these men finally receive the decorations they had earned in 1944. How many other similar stories were never documented, never recognized, lost to history? The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge has been the subject of numerous books, articles, and documentaries. Alex Kershaw's the longest. Winter provided the most comprehensive account of the battle and brought the story to a wider audience. The book became a New York Times bestseller, introducing a new generation to the story of 18 soldiers who changed history. Military historians continue to study the battle as an example of successful small unit defensive tactics. The platoon's action is now taught at Military Mice is a case study in leadership tactics and the importance of individual small unit actions in shaping larger campaigns. The lessons of Lanzerath remain relevant for modern military forces. The importance of well-trained soldiers who can operate independently when communications are lost. The value of junior officers who can make tactical decisions without constant guidance from higher headquarters. The advantage of prepared defensive positions occupied by disciplined troops. The multiplier effect of accurate marksmanship and effective use of terrain. The courage required to stand and fight when vastly outnumbered. These principles transcend time and technology. They were true in 1944 and remain true today. Modern military training emphasizes decentralized decision-making, small unit leadership, and the empowerment of junior leaders. The stand at Lanzerath demonstrates why these principles matter. The story also illustrates the human dimension of war. These were not superhuman warriors, but ordinary young men who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. Ly Buke had enlisted at 14 to help his family during the Depression. Many of his men had been college students before the war. They came from all walks of American life, brought together by the draft and the needs of national defense. When the moment came, they performed heroically, not because they were special, but because they were well-trained, well-led, and committed to their mission and to each other. The bonds formed in combat are among the strongest human connections. The men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon remained close for the rest of their lives, attending reunions, maintaining correspondence, supporting each other through the challenges of post-war life. The Belgian people who lived through the battle and witnessed what the Americans did for their country never forgot. For decades after the war, local residents maintained contact with platoon members, sending letters, hosting visits, ensuring that the sacrifice was remembered. When the monument was dedicated in 2005, 3 generations of Belgian families attended to honor the men who had fought to protect their village. This relationship between liberators and liberated is one of the enduring legacies of World War II. The Americans who fought in Europe were not conquerors, but liberators, and the people they freed remembered and honored that sacrifice. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge stands as a testament to a fundamental truth about warfare. Victory in war is not determined solely by the largest battles or the most famous generals. It is also determined by the cumulative effect of thousands of small actions, many of them by obscure units whose names will never be widely known. Soldiers holding a ridge for a day, a squad holding a bridge for an hour, a platoon defending a crossroads for a night. Each of these small actions multiplied across a theater of war shapes the outcome of campaigns. The soldiers who fought these small engagements often had no idea of the larger strategic importance of their deeds. They simply fulfilled their duty, followed their commands, and stood by their comrades. In doing so, they altered the course of history. Lieutenant Book and his men never set out to become heroes. They were assigned an impossible task and gave everything to see it through. They held their ground for as long as humanly possible. When they were finally overrun, they had accomplished something extraordinary. 92 German casualties inflicted. 18 hours of delay forced upon the enemy's schedule. One of the most decorated small unit stands in the annals of American military history. They proved that bravery, competence, and leadership on the tactical level can yield strategic consequences. They showed that ordinary Americans, when properly trained and inspired, are capable of exceptional feats, even in defeat, in capture, in what might appear as failure by traditional military standards. They achieved victory in the only way that truly matters, by contributing to the success of the greater mission. As the years pass and the veterans of World War II fade from our midst, it becomes ever more vital to preserve and share their stories. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge is not merely a record of battlefield maneuvers and strategic outcomes. It is a story of human valor, of young men who stood firm when retreat would have been easier, who fought on when surrender promised safety, who endured pain and imprisonment with dignity and pride. It is a story that must be told to every new generation, so they understand the price of freedom, the cost of triumph, and the debt owed to those who came before. Each year on December 16th, ceremonies are held at the monument on Lanzerath Ridge, Wreaths are placed, speeches delivered, and the names of the platoon members recited. Belgian students learn about what happened on that frozen hill so long ago. American veterans and service members visit to pay homage. The ritual of remembrance continues, ensuring that the sacrifice endures in memory. As long as we remember what 18 American soldiers accomplished on that December day in 1944, their legacy remains alive. They purchased time with their bravery. They delayed an enemy offensive with their discipline. They upheld their nation's honor with their sacrifice. They embodied the finest traditions of American military service. The saga of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment reminds us that within the vast sweep of history, individual acts still matter. 18 men changed the direction of a battle. Their stand slowed the German advance and contributed to the ultimate Allied success in the Battle of the Bulge, a victory that shortened the war, saved countless lives, and safeguarded liberty in Western Europe. The line from their foxholes on a Belgian ridge to the peaceful world we inhabit today is straight and unbroken. We are the heirs of their courage. We live in freedom because they chose to stand. We dwell in peace because they chose to fight. We owe them a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we can honor it by remembering, by teaching their story, by ensuring their names and deeds never fade. First Lieutenant Lyle Book and the men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon did not fail on December 16, 1944. They succeeded beyond measure. They held the ground they were ordered to hold for as long as any unit could have. They inflicted losses far exceeding their size. They delayed a major enemy push at a pivotal moment. They proved that Americans, even when hopelessly outnumbered, isolated and facing Germany's best, would fight with skill and heart. Their story deserves its place. Beside the more renowned battles and heroes of World War II, they were ordinary men who performed extraordinary deeds when their country needed them most. That is the essence of heroism. That is the legacy of Lanzerath.